The morning of October 14th, 1944, over the industrial city of Schweinfurt in central Germany, Major Heinz brought his VW-190 around for another pass at the American bomber formation. He had already taken down two B-17s that morning. His ammunition counters showed he had enough rounds left for maybe one more engagement before he would have to break off and head back to base. Baer was 24 years old. He had been flying combat missions since 1939. Over 5 years of nearly non-stop combat, he had earned 204 confirmed aerial victories. He was exhausted in a way that went far beyond physical fatigue. It was a deep, settled weariness, woven into his bones, clouding his thoughts, even affecting the way he pulled his aircraft through each maneuver. As he approached the bomber stream, he saw something that had become increasingly common in recent months. The American fighter escorts, P-51 Mustangs, were everywhere. They weren't just guarding the bombers anymore, they were hunting German fighters aggressively and relentlessly. And they were good, not extraordinary, not sharpened by years of combat like the veterans on the German side, but consistently, disturbingly competent. One of the Mustangs broke toward him. Baer assessed the angle, the approach, the speed. The American made no obvious mistakes. His positioning was precise, his energy management was solid. Baer forced his aircraft into a defensive spiral, using every trick he had learned across 5 brutal years of combat. The American stayed with him for several seconds before peeling away, likely low on fuel or ammunition. Baer returned to base. In the dispersal area, he saw that 3 of his squadron's aircraft were missing. 2 of the absent pilots were experienced veterans. The third was a 20-year-old who had arrived only 6 weeks earlier, trained just well enough to function. He had survived exactly 4 missions. That evening in the officers' mess, Baer sat with Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, another seasoned pilot with 176 confirmed victories. They talked quietly about what they had been seeing in the skies. The Americans seemed to have an endless stream of pilots, not exceptional pilots, but competent ones. Men who understood their aircraft, knew their tactics, and avoided the major mistakes that once made for easy kills. Steinhoff mentioned something he had heard during the interrogation of a captured American pilot. The Americans rotated their pilots home after completing a fixed number of combat missions. 25 missions for bomber crews during some periods, 50 missions for fighter pilots in others. After that, they went back to the United States, away from combat entirely. To Baer, this idea felt almost impossible to grasp. Why would anyone pull an experienced fighter pilot out of battle? A pilot who had survived long enough to master his craft, to develop the kind of hard-earned combat instincts that kept him alive. It seemed wasteful, irrational, a decision born from American abundance rather than from sound military reasoning. What Baer couldn't know was that this wasteful policy, the practice of sending home pilots who had finally become highly effective, was creating a long-term advantage so large that it would eventually become unbeatable. Every American pilot who rotated home became a teacher. Each teacher trained dozens of new pilots, and the math of that system would generate results no amount of individual heroism, no matter how remarkable, could ever match. The question that haunted German fighter pilots for the rest of the war was painfully simple. Where are all these Americans coming from? Why don't they run out of pilots? The answer wasn't being forged in the skies over Europe. It was being built in training facilities across the United States, and it represented a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached the challenge of aerial warfare. Part 2: The German System, Logic and Success. The Luftwaffe's method for developing fighter pilots wasn't random. It was founded on solid military logic that had proven itself in the early years of the war. German theorists had studied the air battles of the First World War and reached a clear conclusion about what produced truly effective fighter pilots. Experience meant everything. A pilot who survived his first 5 combat missions had a realistic chance of surviving 50. A pilot who survived 50 might very well survive 500. The learning curve was steep, merciless, and paid for in blood. But once a pilot climbed it, once he mastered the countless split-second choices that separated life from death, his effectiveness rose exponentially. The Luftwaffe identified these survivors and built its fighter force around them. They called them Experten, experts, These were not merely pilots with high victory counts. They were men who possessed a deep intuitive understanding of aerial combat forged through repeated exposure to mortal danger. They understood energy management without needing to think about it. They could read a tactical situation in seconds. They knew exactly what their aircraft could do at the extreme limits of performance because they had been to those limits again and again and survived. Major Erich Hartmann embodied this system completely. He joined Jagdgeschwader 52 on the Eastern Front in October 1942. His first combat missions were disasters. He was shot down by Soviet aircraft. He was nearly killed by Soviet ground fire. He made mistakes that would have been fatal if more experienced pilots in his unit hadn't intervened to save him. But he survived, and he learned. By 1943, he was accumulating victories at a rate that seemed unreal. His final total would reach 352 confirmed aerial victories, a number unmatched by any pilot from any nation in any war. He achieved this through continuous flying, constant combat, and never rotating away from the front lines. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, also of Jagdgeschwader 52, reached 301 confirmed victories. Major Günther Rahl achieved 275. Oberleutnant Otto Kittel reached 202nd victories before being killed in action in February 1945. These were not exceptions. The Luftwaffe had over 100 pilots who each achieved more than 100 confirmed victories. The system that produced such results was built on uninterrupted combat exposure. German fighter pilots flew until they were killed, gravely wounded, or captured. There was no rotation policy, no fixed mission count that guaranteed a trip home. You flew until you couldn't fly anymore. This created a force with intensely concentrated expertise. The top pilots were extraordinarily capable. They could perform missions that seemed impossible. Hartmann, for example, developed a tactical method that minimized his risk while maximizing his success. He would position himself unseen, close the distance until he reached optimal firing range, take one precise high-percentage shot, and then immediately break away. This approach kept him alive through over 400 combat missions. Part 3, Building the World, Context and Ideology. The Luftwaffe's system reflected the broader German military culture and the unique constraints Germany faced as a continental power surrounded by potential enemies. The Wehrmacht had always emphasized quality over quantity. German military theorists believed that superior training, better equipment, and tactical skill could offset numerical disadvantages. This philosophy was deeply rooted in Prussian and German military tradition. During the wars of German unification in the 1860s and 1870s, Prussian forces had defeated larger Austrian and French armies through superior training, excellent staff work, and advanced operational planning. The idea of the highly trained professional soldier, capable of achieving what mass conscript armies could not, became central to German military thinking. In the 1930s, as Germany rebuilt its military in violation of the Versailles Treaty, the Luftwaffe embraced this philosophy for its fighter force. They would develop an elite corps of fighter pilots, men who would receive extensive training and then remain in combat until they reached true mastery of their craft. These experts formed the core of the fighter force, providing leadership and achieving exceptional results that multiplied their impact across the battlefield. The early years of the Second World War seemed to validate this approach entirely. During the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, German pilots of the Condor Legion gained valuable combat experience while supporting nationalist forces. When these veterans returned to Germany, they carried with them practical knowledge of aerial warfare that became crucial once the wider conflict in Europe began. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Luftwaffe fighter pilots encountered Polish aircraft that were generally inferior in performance. The Polish pilots fought courageously, but they were overwhelmed by superior German aircraft and by pilots who had already accumulated real combat experience. The campaign lasted only 5 weeks. The Luftwaffe established air superiority quickly and held it throughout the fighting. In May 1940, during the invasion of France and the Low Countries, Luftwaffe effectiveness was demonstrated again. French and British air forces fielded many aircraft and many brave pilots, but they were ultimately defeated by sharper German tactics and the experience German pilots had carried over from earlier battles. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm dominated the skies, enabling the rapid German advance that led to France's surrender in just 6 weeks. These victories strengthened German confidence in their system. The Exper-10 were proving their value. Pilots like Werner Milders and Adolf Galland became national heroes, their victory counts rising with each campaign. The logic felt undeniable. Keep your best pilots in combat, let them accumulate experience and victories, and they would provide the aerial superiority Germany needed. Even the Battle of Britain, fought from July to October 1940, did not fundamentally challenge this belief, despite ending in a German defeat. The Luftwaffe lost that battle mainly due to strategic and operational miscalculations, not because their pilot development system had failed. German fighter pilots continued to earn impressive individual victory tallies even while losing the overall campaign. While German pilots flew until death or capture, the United States Army Air Forces adopted a fundamentally different approach. This difference was not immediately clear to German commanders. When they first learned about it, many dismissed it as yet another example of American inefficiency and waste. The American rotation policy evolved over the course of the war, but its central principle remained the same. Combat pilots would fly a fixed number of missions and then rotate back to the United States for rest and reassignment, often becoming instructors. For bomber crews in the 8th Air Force operating over Europe, the initial mission requirement was 25. Later, as the war progressed and as tactics and technology improved survival rates, this requirement increased to 30, then to 35 missions. For fighter pilots, the requirements varied by theater and by time period. In Europe, they initially flew 200 to 300 combat hours before rotation. Later in the war, this shifted to fixed mission counts, often around 50 combat missions. In the Pacific, tour lengths were sometimes measured in months rather than missions, typically 6 to 12 months of combat duty. The reasoning behind this policy wasn't obvious at first, even to many American commanders. General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, faced criticism from those who believed the rotation system pulled experienced pilots out of combat just when they were becoming most effective. Why send home a pilot who had survived long enough to master his craft? The answer lay in a deeper understanding of industrial warfare and organizational learning. The American military, especially the Army Air Forces, understood that individual brilliance, no matter how extraordinary, could never match the systemic strength of a well-designed pilot production pipeline. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Cochrane, a fighter pilot who completed a tour in North Africa before returning to the United States as an instructor, explained this logic in a 1944 interview. A pilot who survived 50 combat missions had knowledge of immense value, but that value only mattered if it could be passed on. An experienced pilot in combat might shoot down 2 or 3 enemy aircraft on a great day, but the same pilot serving as an instructor for 6 months could train 50 new pilots, and every one of those pilots would be far more capable because of the quality of his instruction. The mathematics were undeniable. 50 pilots, each just slightly better trained, created far more combat power than one ace, no matter how exceptional. And if each of those 50 pilots completed their own tours and became instructors, the multiplication effect became exponential. The United States had both the industrial strength and the geographic safety to make this system work. American training bases sat deep within the continental United States, far from any danger. Student pilots trained without fear of enemy attack. Fuel was plentiful. Aircraft were abundant. If a trainee damaged a plane, another was simply rolled out. Major training facilities included Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, training naval aviators since 1914. Randolph Field, Texas, known as the West Point of the Air, opened in 1930 and became the primary training base for Army Air Corps pilots. Corpus Christi Naval Air Station, Texas, opened in 1941 and capable of training thousands of pilots at once. Luke Field in Arizona, Thunderbird Field, also in Arizona, and dozens of other facilities spread across the American South and Southwest were producing pilots in numbers that would have seemed unimaginable to European observers. By 1943, the American pilot training program was generating over 100,000 pilots per year across all branches of service. This included fighter pilots, bomber pilots, transport pilots, and every other aviation specialty. The scale had no precedent in military history. Each training base followed a standardized curriculum shaped by combat veterans who had rotated home. Students logged roughly 200 flight hours before receiving their wings. Their training covered basic flying, instrument navigation, formation flying, aerial gunnery, and tactical instruction. After graduation, fighter pilots moved on to additional specialized training tailored to the aircraft they would fly in combat. The American system created a self-reinforcing cycle. One German commanders did not fully grasp until it was far too late. Every combat veteran returning home carried with him the latest tactical knowledge. That knowledge was systematically fed into training programs, ensuring that new pilots learned from the real-time experiences of those who had survived the skies over Europe and the Pacific. Captain Donald Buley, who first flew Spitfires with the Royal Air Force before transferring to the United States Army Air Forces, completed several combat tours. Between them, he served as an instructor and helped develop tactical doctrine for the P-47 Thunderbolt. The lessons he passed on, drawn from real combat, were absorbed by hundreds of student pilots. Those pilots carried that wisdom into battle, where it helped them survive long enough to develop their own experience. This process created what modern analysts call institutional learning. The American military learned as an organization, not just as a collection of individual pilots. Every returning veteran added a data point: his successes, his failures, his tactics, his near-fatal mistakes. All of it became part of a continuously expanding body of knowledge that instructors deliberately passed to new trainees. The contrast with the German system grew sharper as the war continued. German Expert 10 accumulated enormous personal expertise, but when a pilot with 200 victories was shot down and killed, all of that hard-won knowledge vanished with him. The Luftwaffe had no effective way to capture or transmit what those pilots had learned. By 1944, fuel shortages and the desperate need to commit every flyable aircraft to combat meant German pilot training was drastically reduced. New pilots were reaching operational units with barely 160 total flight hours, including basic instruction, far less than what they needed to stay alive in the increasingly unforgiving skies over Europe. They had minimal gunnery training, limited formation flying experience, and almost no tactical instruction. They were sent into combat against Allied pilots who had received twice the amount of training and had been taught by seasoned combat veterans. The outcome was both predictable and tragic. New German pilots were shot down at horrifying rates. On the Eastern Front, a novice pilot's life expectancy was measured in missions, not months. In the West, facing American and British pilots with superior training and overwhelming numbers, survival rates were even lower. German aces frequently found themselves paired with wingmen who were liabilities instead of support, pilots who needed protection rather than offering it. Major Heinz Baer, returning from a mission in November 1944, discovered that his assigned wingman, a 19-year-old with under 200 total flight hours, had become separated from the formation and failed to return. The young pilot's aircraft was later found crashed 30 miles from the combat zone. Investigators concluded he had simply become disoriented and run out of fuel while trying to locate the airfield. His death was caused by inexperience, not the enemy. This scenario repeated itself thousands of times. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots who could not be replaced. Each loss meant the disappearance of years of accumulated knowledge. Meanwhile, the Americans were generating trained pilots faster than they were losing them. If you find this story engaging, please consider subscribing and enabling notifications. It helps us continue producing detailed content like this. The American edge wasn't only numerical, though numbers mattered greatly. It was also qualitative. By late 1944, the average American fighter pilot arriving in Europe had superior training compared to the German pilot he faced. The American pilot had learned from combat veterans. He had extensive gunnery practice. He had spent hundreds of hours mastering formation flying. He knew his aircraft well because he had flown it extensively during training. The German pilot, on the other hand, had received minimal training due to shortages in resources. His gunnery practice was limited because ammunition was scarce. His flight time was reduced because fuel was heavily rationed. He arrived at his unit as a burden, someone who needed to be taught and protected by the few remaining experienced pilots who were themselves exhausted from unending combat. The statistics made clear a reality that individual heroism could not change. In 1943, the United States produced more than 65,000 pilots through its training programs. Germany graduated roughly 15,000 pilots in that same year. By 1944, as German resources tightened and American production continued to rise, the gap became even wider. American training facilities operated at scales that were almost incomprehensible to European observers. At Naval Air Station Corpus Christi alone, over 35,000 pilots received training between 1941 and 1945. The base spanned more than 2,000 acres and included multiple auxiliary airfields. At peak operation, it had over 700 aircraft assigned for training purposes. Thunderbird Field in Arizona, run as a civilian contract school under military supervision, graduated more than 10,000 pilots during the war. Luke Field, also in Arizona, trained over 12,000 pilots. These were just individual facilities. The United States operated dozens of similar training bases, each producing hundreds or thousands of pilots annually. The industrial support for this program was equally impressive. The United States produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the Second World War, a significant portion of which were dedicated training aircraft. The Vultee BT-13 Valiant, a basic trainer, had over 11,000 units produced. The North American AT-6 Texan, an advanced trainer, saw more than 15,000 examples built for American and Allied use. These planes existed solely to train pilots, an investment in human capital that Germany could not match. German training, by contrast, suffered the opposite problem. As the war dragged on and Germany's situation worsened, fuel allocations for training were repeatedly cut. By 1944, German training units received barely enough fuel to give students minimal flying hours. Advanced training, covering tactical skills and combat techniques, was largely eliminated. New pilots were expected to acquire these skills at operational units if they survived long enough. The survival statistics reflected this disparity. In 1944, a new American fighter pilot arriving in Europe had roughly a 70% chance of completing his first combat tour and returning home. A new German fighter pilot arriving at an operational unit that same year had less than a 30% chance of surviving 3 months. These differences were not about courage or determination. German pilots fought with extraordinary bravery against overwhelming odds. The differences lay in systems, industrial capacity, and the fundamental approach to developing combat pilots. The American system produced more pilots, better trained pilots, and preserved combat knowledge by rotating experienced veterans home to teach others. Major Erich Hartmann, still flying combat in early 1945 with 352 confirmed victories, led a formation that included 2 new pilots with less than 50 hours in the Messerschmitt Bf-109. He had to focus nearly all his attention on keeping these inexperienced pilots alive, which limited his own effectiveness. After one mission, he wrote in his diary that he felt less like a fighter pilot and more like a flight instructor conducting training under combat conditions. The irony, which he may not have fully grasped, was that American flight instructors were doing exactly that, conducting training, but they did it safely in the United States, with ample fuel, aircraft, and time to properly prepare their students for combat. By January 1945, the mathematical consequences of these differing systems could no longer be ignored. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was collapsing, not primarily due to a lack of aircraft, though that was becoming an issue, but because of a shortage of qualified pilots. German factories continued producing fighter aircraft. In some months, production even increased despite Allied bombing. Yet there were not enough trained pilots to fly these planes effectively. Operation Bodenplatte, launched on January 1, 1945, revealed this crisis with brutal clarity. The operation was a massive strike against Allied airfields in Belgium, Holland, and France, involving over 900 Luftwaffe aircraft. It was one of the largest single-day deployments of German air power during the war. The goal was to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground, especially the tactical fighters supporting ground forces. The attack achieved limited success. Nearly 300 Allied aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground, and several airfields were temporarily put out of action. But the cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. Over 270 German aircraft were lost. Critically, more than 230 German pilots were killed or captured. Many of them experienced formation leaders with hundreds of missions and dozens of victories. Their loss was irreplaceable. Major Heinz Baer survived Bodenplatte, but he lost 4 pilots from his unit. 2 were killed and 2 were captured after being shot down over Allied-held territory. One of the dead pilots had 96 confirmed victories. His knowledge, tactical expertise, and years of combat experience all died with him. The Luftwaffe had no system to preserve his lessons, no way to pass his hard-won wisdom to the next generation of pilots. By contrast, the Americans could absorb losses that would have been devastating for Germany. When an experienced American pilot was shot down and killed, his knowledge was not lost because it had already been transmitted. Before deployment, he had been trained by instructors who were combat veterans. Upon completing his tour and rotating home, he became an instructor himself, teaching new pilots the lessons he had learned. His death represented the loss of a single pilot, not the loss of all the accumulated knowledge he possessed. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe never recovered. Fuel shortages worsened as Allied advances cut off oil supplies from Romania and bombings destroyed synthetic fuel plants. The few remaining experienced pilots flew fewer missions because fuel was scarce. New pilots arrived with training barely sufficient for them to take off and land safely, let alone engage in combat. In February 1945, Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jagdgeschwader 7 and equipped with the new Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, wrote in his diary about the situation. He had 176 confirmed victories and was a seasoned combat leader, yet he commanded a unit where most pilots had never flown a jet before being assigned. These pilots were learning to operate revolutionary technology while simultaneously trying to master combat tactics against an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority. The Me-262 was extraordinary, the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of speeds over 540 mph. It was faster than any Allied fighter, and its 4 30mm cannons could destroy a bomber in a single burst. But the aircraft was also difficult to fly, required long runways, and demanded intensive maintenance. Giving such a machine to minimally trained pilots was a recipe for disaster. On March 18, 1945, Steinhoff himself was severely burned when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff. The accident was caused by a tire failure, but Steinhoff later reflected that fatigue from months of continuous operations had slowed his reactions. An experienced pilot in peak condition might have saved the aircraft. He survived, but his combat career was over. Another highly experienced pilot removed from combat, his knowledge no longer available to the Luftwaffe. While Germany's pilot force collapsed, the American system continued producing dividends that extended far beyond the immediate combat situation. Pilots who rotated home after completing tours did not simply become instructors and then fade from history. Many became the foundation of American military aviation for decades after the war. Colonel Francis Gabreski completed his first combat tour in Europe with 28 confirmed aerial victories, becoming one of the top American aces. He rotated home, served as an instructor, and then returned for a second combat tour. After the war, he remained in the newly independent United States Air Force. During the Korean War, he flew F-86 Sabres, achieving 6.5 more victories, making him one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 wars. He retired as a colonel in 1967, having served as a senior officer and passed on his knowledge through multiple generations of pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Johnson completed a combat tour in Europe with 27 confirmed victories. He rotated home, served briefly as a test pilot and instructor, then left active duty after the war. Yet his knowledge continued to shape American aviation. He wrote extensively about air combat tactics, consulted for the Air Force, and helped train new generations of fighter pilots through his writings and lectures. His book Thunderbolt, published in 1958, became required reading at Air Force training facilities. Major Thomas Maguire, who achieved 38 confirmed victories in the Pacific Theater, was killed in action in January 1945 during what would have been his final combat tour before rotation. But before his death, he had already contributed to the training program. During a brief period in the United States between combat deployments, Maguire spent 2 months at a training facility in California, sharing his tactical knowledge with student pilots. Those students carried his lessons into combat. Some survived the war and became instructors themselves, passing on what Maguire had taught them. This multiplication effect, the geometric expansion of knowledge, was precisely what the American system was designed to achieve. Each combat veteran who rotated home created dozens of more capable pilots. Each of those pilots, if they survived their own tours, could become instructors and train dozens more. The system was exponential in its impact. The institutional knowledge accumulated in American training facilities represented a strategic asset whose value was difficult to quantify but impossible to overstate. By 1945, American training curricula incorporated lessons from hundreds of thousands of combat missions. Student pilots learned from the collective experience of every American pilot who had completed a tour and returned home. They learned what worked and what didn't. They learned which tactics kept you alive and which got you killed. They learned from mistakes that other pilots had made and survived to report. German pilots, by contrast, learned primarily from their own mistakes, if they survived them. New German pilots arrived at operational units with minimal training and no exposure to combat veterans' knowledge because those veterans were still flying combat, exhausted and increasingly desperate, until they were killed or the war ended. The statistical impact was clear. In the final months of the war, American fighter pilots in Europe were achieving kill ratios exceeding 5-1 against German aircraft. This was not because American pilots were naturally superior or because American aircraft were overwhelmingly better, though numerical superiority certainly helped. It was because American pilots were better trained, had been taught by combat veterans, understood their aircraft thoroughly, and had learned tactics that maximized their advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Major Erich Hartmann surrendered to American forces, who then turned him over to the Soviets. He spent 10 years in Soviet captivity, not returning to Germany until 1955. Major Gerhard Barkhorn survived the war and later joined the post-war West German Luftwaffe, serving until 1975. Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer survived 404 combat missions and 220 confirmed victories, making him one of the few top German aces to survive the entire war. These men were extraordinarily skilled pilots who achieved results that seemed impossible, yet their individual excellence could not overcome the systemic advantages held by their opponents. After the war, several German aces acknowledged this reality in interviews and memoirs. Barkhorn later stated that by 1944 he knew Germany had lost the air war, not because German pilots lacked courage or skill, but because the mathematics were insurmountable. The American rotation policy, which had seemed wasteful and inefficient to German observers, had created a force that was both quantitatively and qualitatively superior. The United States ended the war with thousands of trained pilots, extensive training facilities, and an institutional knowledge base that would support American military aviation for decades. The Luftwaffe ended the war with only a handful of surviving aces, destroyed training facilities, and no systematic method to preserve or transmit the knowledge gained through 6 years of combat. Post-war analysis by American and British military historians confirmed what had become apparent during the war's final year. The rotation policy was not merely a humanitarian gesture or morale-building exercise, though it served both purposes. It was a force multiplier of enormous strategic significance. By systematically rotating experienced pilots home to become instructors, the United States created a training pipeline that produced pilots faster than they could be lost in combat and ensured that each new pilot was better trained than his predecessor. The German expert system, by contrast, concentrated expertise in individuals whose knowledge died with them. It produced impressive individual records, but failed to build institutional capacity. When those experts were inevitably lost to combat attrition, both their experience and their value to the system were lost. The lessons learned extended beyond World War II. The United States applied similar rotation policies during the Korean War, and with some modifications during the Vietnam War. The principle remained constant. Individual expertise is valuable, but institutional knowledge is strategic. A military force that systematically captures and transmits combat experience through its training pipeline creates advantages that individual heroism, no matter how exceptional, cannot overcome. For the German aces who survived the war, there was a bitter recognition of what might have been. If Germany had possessed the industrial capacity and strategic depth to implement a rotation policy similar to America's, if German training facilities could have operated safely thousands of miles from combat zones, if fuel and aircraft had been available for extensive training, the air war might have progressed differently. But Germany never possessed these advantages, and the expert system, for all its creation of individual excellence, could not compensate for fundamental strategic disadvantages. The story that began with Major Heinz Bear Heine's confusion over American rotation policy ended with a broader truth about industrial warfare. Individual skill matters, training matters, equipment matters, but systems matter more. The side that builds better systems for developing, preserving, and transmitting expertise creates advantages that accumulate over time until they become overwhelming. The American rotation policy was such a system, and its success demonstrated a principle that remains valid. In modern warfare, the nation that treats human capital as systematically as it treats material resources gains advantages that individual heroism cannot overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.